Toronto, Canada was, until the last part of the 20th century, the world's best-kept secret. Located on the north side of Lake Ontario, over the years, the city quietly grew and prospered. As we look at the Sam McBride ferry boat docking at Toronto Island, it should be pointed out that Toronto had one of the best transportation systems in North America. We owe a debt of gratitude to local transit fans and those visiting our city who took photos and home movies of Toronto's transportation vehicles. Without their interest, we would not have had a visual record of Toronto's changing landscape. By mid-century, Toronto citizens were patronizing an efficient transportation system dedicated to winning riders away from the automobile. Bill Hood, author of the book The Toronto Civic Railways, is a retired streetcar and subway motorman. He spent most of his career operating out of Danforth Car House in Toronto's East End. He'll be our guide as we tour the line.
In the early days, the Bloor-Danforth line was operated by two separate companies, the privately owned Toronto Railway Company and the city-owned Civic Railways. In West Toronto, a short stub line was operated by the Civic Railway from Dundas to Runnymede. From just east of Broadview, TRC cars would meet the Danforth Civic Railway cars to exchange passengers. There were no transfers issued between the two companies, so riders would have to pay an additional 3-cent fare beyond Broadview. When the Toronto Transportation Commission began operations on September the 1st, 1921, they acquired control of the Toronto railway system and the routes that comprised the Civic Railways. On Danforth, the Civic cars were replaced by new Peter Witt trains. By the 1930s, the area was completely built up, and Danforth Avenue was a major thoroughfare. Grey Coach Lines, a TTC subsidiary, used Danforth as an eastern approach to its Midtown bus terminal. Ex-Toronto Railway cars were placed in mixed service along Danforth, as well as other routes. The hub of East End streetcar operations was the Danforth Car House. Built in 1915 by the Civic Railways, the building and yards were expanded by the TTC in 1921. Crosstown service along Bloor and Danforth was provided by 41 large Witts, pulling 3-door trailers. These TTC movies taken in the late 1930s capture the final days of the Burnies that ran on Coxwell. Inherited from the Civic Railway, they were retired in 1940 and sent to Halifax for wartime service. A Sherburne TRC car joins the parade of cars, leaving the yard for the morning rush. In 1950, when these movies were taken, the wooden TRC cars had reached the end of their service life and were relegated to limited rush hour service on King and Carlton. When I joined the TTC in May 1947, our initial training was on the standard equipment, such as the Witts and Toronto Railway cars. PCC training did not come for another 6 months. As a result, when we were assigned a rush hour run on Bloor, we were given a small Witt for the trip. The only time I ever operated a Toronto Railway car on Bloor was during the 1947 Santa Claus Parade. In the early 1930s, the presidents of 25 major North American transit properties met to discuss the development of a new modern streetcar. Toronto was a premier member of that committee. In 1938, the TTC received delivery of 140 cars, which was, at the time, the largest single order of PCCs purchased in North America. After initial runs on St. Clair, service began on the Bloor route as additional cars were delivered. The new cars were an operator's delight. They had air-operated doors and brakes, comfortable seats, and foot pedals like an automobile. The operator's controls were conveniently located and clearly labeled. The cars had quick acceleration, allowing them to keep pace with auto traffic.
The TTC could not acquire new PCC cars because of the Second World War. After the war, they ordered 100 St. Louis-built all-electric cars from Canadian Car and Foundry. The cars were based at Lansdowne and Danforth car houses. In 1949, 100 all-electric PCCs equipped with couplers were purchased for multiple-unit operation on Bloor-Danforth. The original passenger shelter at Jane Loop was relocated. It was necessary to tear down 2 properties facing Bloor Street so that the track could be realigned to allow multiple-unit trains to exit safely. In 1954, the municipalities surrounding Toronto joined to form Metropolitan Toronto. and the TTC acquired all the private suburban bus and car routes. A new name and logo was adopted. The new Toronto Transit Commission embarked on a mammoth expansion into the suburbs that fed riders into the crosstown Bloor route.
In the morning rush hour, MU cars would leave Lansdowne Car House as single units and would pair with another single car at Jane from either the same division or Danforth, depending on the schedule. At Jane Loop in both AM and PM rush hours, cars would either be coupled or uncoupled. When they entered the loop as a train, they would use the outer platform track to be uncoupled by shedmen and would exit as single units. The inner track was used to store disabled units or extras that would fill gaps in the service. At very busy times when loading of cars became heavy, female TTC personnel called guides would sell tickets and make change for passengers boarding the cars.
The Jane Loop was reconfigured so that Grey Coach Line's buses would enter clockwise in a small loop facing Bloor Street. There was a small newsstand and ticket wicket housed in the terminal. The Annette trolley coaches and suburban buses would loop behind the streetcars where there was more platform space. Riders getting off the buses were steps away from the connecting trolleys. As we pass by present-day Bloor West Village, let's join Bill for our trip along the Bloor-Danforth line.
Streetcar service through this area was started by the Civic Railways in 1915 as a result of the privately owned Toronto Railway and the Toronto Suburban Railway refusing to make the capital investment for the construction of the line. In Civic Railway days, this area was a vast wilderness. The deep ravine between Quebec and Runnymede had to be filled in to allow the laying of Civic Railway track, a project which took almost 3 years to complete. High Park was a favorite destination for school field trips and summer day camps. A loop was built in 1947 at the park entrance for short-turning cars, but was mainly used for charters so children would not have to cross busy Bloor Street. Many times I arrived with a charter car full of happy children, anxious to spend the day in the park. At the end of the day, I would have to open the car windows to rid the car of the smells of critters and fish that the kids would collect to take home.
The Park Loop not only provided off-street unloading for charter groups, but was also used for short-turn looping of king cars. It is interesting to note that the cars heading for this loop would not put up the High Park exposure on their destination signs, but were usually signed Jane. On this occasion, Dundas cars were rerouted because of subway construction at Bloor and Dundas. Today, there is no trace that there ever was a streetcar loop located here.
The hills on either side of Keele Street were very slippery and treacherous for automobiles, with even the lightest snowfall. Cars would slide around, spinning their wheels and blocking the tracks. Streetcars, of course, had perfect traction in icy weather. All the operator had to do was to drop sand for traction. One snowy day, I left Danforth Car House with a train around 3 o'clock to do 2 round trips to Jane. We ended up just doing 1 trip and still arrived back at the car house 30 minutes late because of the stalled autos. The Civic Railway Car House was located north of Bloor at the corner of Indian Road. The building held 3 single-truck Preston-built cars, later replaced in 1920 by 3 Bernies.
On the north side of Bloor, from Runnymede to Indian Road, there are 7 gas stations that today no longer exist. Some on the south side of Bloor lasted a little longer. The neighborhood movie theater, The State, was also closed and converted to offices and retail stores. Situated on the southeast corner of Dundas and Bloor was Fran's Restaurant, which was noted for its coffee. As the neighborhood changed, it was demolished, and today a high school is located on this site.
During the construction of the Bloor-Danforth subway, Vincent Loop had to be relocated. Wooden planks, guardrails, and track bridged the excavation for the Dundas West subway platforms. Cars now exited onto Vincent Street. Automobile traffic was restricted, while streetcars were occasionally diverted to Park Loop, with service north of Vincent being provided by buses. In the late 1940s, on one occasion while I was operating on the King route, I witnessed an inspector divert a two-man Toronto railway car with trailer east along Bloor Street to fill a gap in the Bloor service. On my first run of the day passing the Canada Bread plant, I could smell the odor of freshly baked bread and cakes, one of the more pleasant aromas on the line. Between Dundas and Lansdowne, the Bloor line passed under 3 sets of overpasses carrying railway tracks. There were no traffic lights at Symington, and very rarely was anyone waiting at the car stop. So this is one of the few spots where I could accelerate to make up a little lost time. When it became known that the Bloor-Danforth streetcar line would soon be replaced by a subway, photographers came from all over the world to take pictures of them. On this occasion, a sharp-eyed operator spots our cameraman and slows down for him to get a good shot.
Lansdowne Car House was an all-streetcar division until the Lansdowne car line was converted to trolley coach operation in 1947.
Lansdowne Car House, built by the Toronto Railway Company in 1911, had the only indoor ladder track in the city. It was used frequently for short-turning Bloor cars, and one yard track was always kept clear of other equipment for this purpose. On the Bloor line, eastbound AM rush trips were always extremely heavy, and by the time the MU trains reached Ossington or Christie, they were filled to capacity. At these times, empty trains entered service from Lansdowne to provide extra carrying capacity. Carlton cars operated out of both Danforth and Lansdowne car houses. In addition to doing the Bloor-Danforth run, I would often do crews on Carlton out of Danforth. The Harbour car line meandered across the city from Sinclair and Townsley through the downtown district ending at Pape and Danforth. It shared trackage with the Bloor line between Dovercourt and Ossington. Harbour between Ossington and Spadina was the only street where a Bloor MU train was allowed to divert from route, since there were only manual switches at Spadina and no switches at all at Bathurst and Harbour. The train ran south on Ossington, east on Harbour and north on Spadina to Bloor, waiting its turn to go west into service.
The Harbour cars ran north on Ossington to Royce Loop prior to the introduction of the Ossington trolleybus route. East of Shaw Street is Christie Pitts, so named because it was a former brickyard reclaimed by the city in the 1930s. At Markham Street is the home of Honest Ed's, the city's most famous retailer. Over the past century, two neighborhood movie theaters, the Alhambra and the Midtown, which today is called the Bloor, provided the nightlife in the Bloor-Bathurst area.
Approaching Spadina, I am reminded of the days when the double-ended ex-Civic Railway cars on the Spadina line would change ends at Bloor before proceeding south. This line was replaced by these Mack buses, which were the largest additions to the fleet at that time.
St. George Station was the terminus of the University Subway. It was really an extension of the Yonge Line, which ran north from Union Station. The Annette trolleybus was extended to this station when the University Line was opened, and the Danforth multiple unit cars used this loop to let off their passengers from the east. It was felt that riders would much rather take the lightly used subway here rather than the heavily crowded Yonge Line. Occasionally in rush hours, Bloor cars turn in here for the westbound return trip. The increased commercial development in the area meant greater transit needs and more streetcar traffic. The loop was just opposite Varsity Stadium, which was part of the University of Toronto. Bill relates to us the hazards of being a streetcar operator.
One eventful afternoon, I was eastbound, stopped in traffic near the Bedford Loop when the trolley pole on a single car leaving the loop dewired and brought down some of the overhead on top of my car. I stayed put while the inspector phoned in, and a crew soon arrived to free me from the wires, with no harm done.
Towards the end of streetcar service, two single ex-Cincinnati PCCs were assigned to fill gaps in service. One car came eastbound from Lansdowne Car House to Bedford Loop. The other came westbound from Coxwell and can be seen later in the Yonge Subway transfer platform.
During the construction of the University Subway, Bloor cars were diverted around a temporary shoe fly built on the sidewalk on the south side of the road. This section was heavily congested with pedestrian traffic, both in the morning and early evening. Operators had to use extreme caution through this section, as there were no barriers separating the pedestrians from the streetcars. Automobile traffic in this area was prohibited while construction proceeded.
Park Plaza Hotel was built in the early 1930s during the Depression. It sat vacant until 1936 because it was rumored to have been built on quicksand, and I suppose it took that many years for the quicksand to harden. Today it's been renamed and serves a high-income bracket clientele. This view, looking north onto Bloor Street, is taken from the Colonnade, Canada's first commercial retail residential complex. Built in 1961, it was later expanded in 1964. Across the street is the University Theatre, built in 1949. It was one of the largest in Canada at 1,382 seats. It used a 1930s design for its facade, which still remains today. This section of Bloor Street West is Toronto's version of New York's Fifth Avenue, with its high-ticketed, trendy boutiques and shops. During these days, cobblestones were placed between the rails. The roadway was rough, which would discourage automobile traffic from riding on the right-of-way. The use of cobblestones also allowed for spot track repair without closing the road and repaving it. In freezing temperatures, there was more play in the expansion and contraction of the rail. With asphalt covering, the heaving of the rails in freezing temperatures would erode the asphalt, forming potholes. Towards the end, potholes abounded adjacent to the track bed.